Happy Saturday. It's July 13th, 2024, and you are listening to Morning Meeting. I'm Ashley Baker in London.
And I'm Michael Haney in New York City.
And it's been yet another unpredictable week in the news. Well, Joe Biden seems to have adopted at least one Trumpian tendency, ignoring common sense. The president is rejecting mounting pressure to end his re-election campaign. Meanwhile, he's using a run-out-the-clock strategy to remain in power as Democrats and democracy lovers panic. Over in Russia, a court has ordered the arrest of Yulia Navalny, the widow of the late opposition leader Alexei Navalny, who died 5 months ago in a Russian penal colony under very mysterious circumstances. Navalny left Russia in 2021. Currently, she's operating Navalny's anti-corruption foundation out of exile in Lithuania. Meanwhile, in France, more shocking news. The far-right National Rally didn't do nearly as well as expected in the recent runoff elections. They went mostly in favor of the cobbled-together left-wing coalition, the New Popular Front. It looks like Macron is not nearly as bonkers as the world thought a few weeks ago. But as usual, airmail is the antidote to all of that drama, and we've got a great issue and a great episode of Morning Meeting here to take your mind elsewhere.
Absolutely. First, Todd Purdom, a longtime political reporter for the New York Times, will join us from Los Angeles to explain why Democrats have only themselves to blame for finding themselves now locked in a Mexican standoff with a very, very stubborn octogenarian. Then, we all know how Ozempic and Wegovy have reduced millions of waistlines around the world in the last few years. But in Denmark, where the drugs are exclusively manufactured, Ozempic and Wegovy have made many people very, very wealthy. In fact, the drugs have added almost 2% to the country's GDP. So, what are all these people doing with their money? Mary Holland will join us to tell us how these newly rich Danes are transforming a small town on the coast to a version of New York's East End. And finally, Stu Heritage will join us from London to tell us why Neil Gaiman, one of the most popular writers of the past 3 decades and the creator of such hits as Sandman and more, finds himself accused of sexual assault. Ashley, where would you like to begin today?
Well, Michael, I think we should begin with Todd Purdom. You know, we've been talking so much about Biden's inner circle and who's responsible for this kerfuffle, and it turns out Todd knows some of these characters intimately. He's a longtime political reporter and a contributor to Airmail, and we're thrilled to have him here to talk about the latest in Biden land. Welcome, Todd.
Good morning.
Todd, the Democrats find themselves in a mess of biblical proportions. How did we end up here?
Bit by bit, I think, is the short answer, and maybe wishful thinking. It's been pretty clear to anyone that Joe Biden is not the same Joe Biden he was 4 years ago, and he's not the same Joe Biden he was 10 years ago. But it wasn't until the debate that it became evident for 50 million people that Joe Biden really qualitatively different. And I think his aides and his supporters in the Democratic Party had convinced themselves, because they're so desperate to beat Donald Trump, that despite his diminished capacities, be okay. And they were lulled into that by the fact that his diminished capacity has apparently been gradual. But suddenly there's one of those moments where it tipped over, and the debate was that moment.
Todd, what was going through your mind when you watched the debate?
Better question is what was going through my stomach. Enormous somersaults, backflips, triple axles. It was so uncomfortable. You wanted to look away. It was like a train wreck. I mean, it was like having a member of your family collapse in public. And he really seemed to be struggling so hard. You were in there kind of like your kid at the Little League home plate, hoping that he wouldn't be hit by a ball or something. And it was really tough. Just as a citizen, it was really hard to watch.
You know, Todd, a lot of the blame has been placed on Biden's inner circle, who have been accused of hiding his deteriorating condition from the press and the public. But you know many of these people in his inner circle. How do you interpret these actions?
Yeah, I mean, I do know. I'm old enough, and they've been around long enough, and his circle is just small enough that I actually know virtually all of them personally, and I'm unwilling to ascribe ill intent to them. I mean, I think they're honorable people. I don't think they've, quote unquote, lied. I think they've perhaps kidded themselves that the president has good days and bad days, or bad days and better days, and he could get through this. And obviously, it wasn't a completely irrational bet, but they gambled wrong. And on the world stage, that gamble was shown up for what it was. It's like when your child is growing up in front of your eyes and you don't see the changes, and then your sister or brother or mother comes and says, "Oh my God, Johnny is so tall now," or "Look how his hair has grown." And I say in my piece, it's like the fallacy of the boiling frog. The frog sits in the increasingly hot pot of water and doesn't really understand what's happening until finally it's dead. I mean, I think something like that is what's happened with President Biden.
Todd, you talk in your column this week, use a phrase which I thought was very accurate. The people around him, his inner circle, and maybe even the leaders of the Democratic Party, is it deception? Maybe, but you kind of call it deception by omission. And you sort of liken it a little bit to maybe even FDR's health in the waning days of World War II and the campaign of 44. Can you tell us a little bit about your thinking on that?
Well, yes. I mean, when Mike McCurry was Bill Clinton's press secretary, he used to like to say that it was his job to tell the truth slowly. which meant that he was conscious of never telling a lie, but he didn't tell the press everything he knew on every occasion. And I think way before the debate, I had started reading about FDR in 1944, just because I was looking at Biden and thinking about what happens when a candidate's running for re-election when maybe his health is in jeopardy. And my old boss, Joe Leleveld, the late Joe Leleveld of the New York Times, had written this very powerful book called His Final Battle about FDR's last year. So a couple of months ago, I had actually dipped back into that book again. And what's remarkable about FDR's last year in office is that his doctors knew conclusively that he was dying of congestive heart failure. And they didn't tell him, and he didn't ask, and they took his blood pressure every day, and he never even asked what it was. His daughter came to understand the depth of the problem. It's not clear that Eleanor Roosevelt ever even really understood quite how sick he was. And he died 82 days after he was inaugurated for his fourth term. So I think it's not inconceivable that something like that's going on in the White House now, in which the people around President Biden don't really want to know exactly what may be wrong with him, so that they can content themselves or persuade themselves that he can make it. And in 1944, the Democrats persuaded themselves that it was so important that FDR win and finish the war that it was worth taking a risk. And they picked Harry Truman as vice president in part because they thought he might well become president. And that's what happened. So I don't know. The whole situation it's really a sad situation.
Todd, one of the things you also mentioned is this kind of win at all cost mentality around a Biden team or inside that group and butting up against with reality. So I imagine when this is all said and done, years from now, months from now, whatever, there's going to be incredible books written like the last days of Roosevelt. Who do you think is going to come off looking bad in this?
That's a good question. I think the party leadership will come off looking bad for not having gone to Joe Biden after the 2022 midterms, when the Democrats did better than expected and held off the predicted red wave of the Republicans, and to say to him, look, you have a perfect opportunity to pivot, and we have a deep bench of talented younger people, and you should go take a break. On the other hand, this presupposes that anyone could ever really persuade Joe Biden, because people who run for president and become president are different than you and me, Michael. They wake up in the morning and they look at the mirror and say, damn, I'm good. And I suppose in that sense, the person who will come off badly is President Biden, who seems to be, with both hands, throwing out the window his well-earned reputation as a conscientious lover of his country who's determined to save it from the predations of Donald Trump. And it's really hard to think that he's doing anything else but make Donald Trump's victory more likely right now, anyway.
Todd, it seems like we're faced right now with only bad outcomes, but what is, in your view, the best of those bad outcomes? What's our best path forward here?
After the 2016 election and Donald Trump's victory, I hung up my prediction cleats. Not that I ever really liked making predictions as a political reporter, but I think you're right. What's happening now, I think, is every action is risky. Every outcome is potentially risky. It seems really risky to just do nothing, to keep the status quo, to have President Biden slog ahead. It would be risky to replace him with Kamala Harris. It would be really risky to try to open up the field of the convention and see who might prevail in a sort of a free-for-all. That could bring out all the worst divisions in the Democratic Party. Remember, more than 100 years ago, Will Rogers, the great columnist, said that he was a member of no organized party. He was a Democrat. And those strains and stresses in the party have only increased. So I think nobody knows for sure what would be the best outcome. But it does seem pretty safe to say that doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result is a recipe for disaster. And that's where we are right now.
Todd, just because you are so well-sourced in the political universe, are you hearing anything from senior Democratic people, what they wish if they could have a perfect world, what would happen?
Well, I think there's quiet desperation. I mean, I think some of them are just want anything other than what's happening right now. I think many of them have come to the conclusion that Vice President Harris might in fact be a strong candidate, stronger than they thought. There's something that happens to you when you become the nominee of a major political party. There's an almost chemical change that comes over you in the sense that you become the standard bearer of millions of people. Her strengths have never really been tested in that environment with that wind at her back. So there would be an outpouring of money and energy and volunteers. And I think a lot of younger people who have not been excited about President Biden would be more excited about her, or indeed any other younger option in the party. I think that people just want something to happen because they don't think that the current course is sustainable. And you see that in a very delicate way this week with Nancy Pelosi. After President Biden insisted he was in and it was all over and no doubt about it, she re-raised the issue, well, he needs to decide quickly. And by saying he needs to decide quickly after he's already said he's decided, it's a bank shot way of saying you really need to reconsider.
Yeah, it was a little bit like on a game show. Is that your final answer?
Yes, exactly.
Before we turn over this card and you see your fate, what is it? Yeah. As you also note in your column this week, is he the president in the Oval Office or is he simply a resident in the Oval Office right now? I think everyone is waiting to see who reveals himself here.
Yes, and I think one of the big problems in the 2 weeks since the debate is there have been all these calls by party elders and the press for the White House to put the president in multiple, repeated, unscripted settings where he can show that he's up to the job. And they haven't really done that. And it's impossible to escape the conclusion that they haven't really done that because they know in their heart of hearts that he can't reliably rise to the occasion. So they don't put him in that situation. It's a problem that if they could have fixed, they would have fixed. And the fact that they haven't fixed it, to me, means they can't fix it. And that's why this sense of being trapped is making so many Democrats feel desperate.
Yeah, and it also just puts so much gas in the tank of Trump supporters, which is just like, we told you so. There was a cover. They were covering for him. Deep state, whatever it is, but it also it makes that narrative all the more plausible for so many people.
Yes, it just confirms the worst feelings of so many people that the game isn't on the level, that everybody lies, that the Biden administration has been covering up his frailty, and it just buttresses the feeling that the whole game is rigged, which is, of course, it's painful to say, Michael, but Donald Trump's diagnosis that American politics is broken is not wrong. His prescription for fixing it is wrong, but his diagnosis about the fact that the game is not on the level is correct. And that's one reason why so many people have flocked to him over the years. And it's a reason why in 2015, some smarty pants columnists said what he was doing in shaking up the system was a wonderful thing because, of course, he could never win. I never believed that prescription. I think the minute you say something can't happen in American politics is about the moment when it can. But one of Trump's extraordinary powers is that he has put his finger on something that's deeply wrong about American life, and people get that.
Well, Todd, this is obviously a story that's going to continue to unfold, but thank you so much for your incredible thoughts and commentary. We look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Thanks so much, Todd.
Michael, let's get Stu Heritage on here. Neil Gaiman is not an especially known quantity in the US, but in the UK, this guy is, or shall we say was, a god. Stu is a writer at large for Airmail, as well as a contributor to The Guardian and many other publications. Welcome, Stu.
Oh.
So, Stu, Neil Gaiman, a known name and a known quantity in the UK, less familiar to American audiences. So let's start off by saying, who is this guy?
He is a fantasy writer, primarily, fantasy and science fiction. He's written a number of comic books that people seem to really, really enjoy that are just starting to be adapted into television shows. So Good Omens, the Amazon show, that's based on his work. The Sandman, the Netflix show Sandman, that's also his work. He's written things like American Gods. He's written episodes of Doctor Who. He's a real fixture in the sort of the British fantasy sci-fi scene.
And he was known, Stu, right, for being somewhat of a proto-feminist back in the day. I mean, tell us about, as you have in your story, some of his early work was really seen as kind of pioneering in this category.
Yeah, he's been very sort of on social media, quite outspoken about a lot of feminist issues. And weirdly, and I think this is the crux of it, is he's been accused of sexual assault. And the details of the allegations quite closely mirror one of the issues of the Sandman comics that he wrote in 1990, I believe, which was about an author who was also a rapist and made the woman he imprisoned and raped, made her call him master, which is just one of the horrible details that it turns out he allegedly made his former nanny do.
And Stu, this was reported in a Tortoise investigation by Rachel Johnson and Paul Galizia, and this has been dominating headlines in the UK for the past week or so. Why was this so shocking to everyone?
I think it's sort of the progressive man whose public persona never really sort of hinted at that. He was married to Amanda Palmer, who is a strident feminist singer and writer. It seemed like they were kind of at some point the sort of the poster couple for, just progressive feminist causes. He's always had an element of sort of darkness to him in that he dresses in black all the time and he's got floppy hair. And I think he sort of embraces the darker fantasy aspects of his personality. I mean, it just came as a surprise to everyone, I think.
So what exactly was he accused of doing?
So there are two allegations made about him. Both are similar in that they're about rough and non-consensual sex with people who are much younger than him. There was a woman who's identified in the podcast only as Kay, and she was 18 when she met him and he was 43, and she was a fan of his. And then the most recent one, the thing that I think kicks off the podcast being made in the first place was there's a woman called Scarlett who worked as the family nanny. She was 23, I think, and he was 61. In both of these stories, there's a big age difference and it's a very sort of out of whack power dynamic going on.
These accusations, like, as I think the Tortoise podcast explores really delicately, like there's some murkiness there, right? Like, can you explain some of the discussion around the issues of consent here?
Yeah, this is where it gets really confusing, actually, because it's as part of the investigation, Scarlett offered up all the messages that she'd been sending Neil Gaiman. And in a lot of them, she sounds very sort of besotted and thankful. And in a way that they speak to, I think it's a criminal lawyer in the podcast, who says that the messages imply consent. So that's such a grey area. At the same time that she was sending him these messages, she was Googling to see whether or not he'd ever been accused of any other sort of sexual inappropriateness. And as well, there's just a weird detail. Amanda Palmer, his ex-wife, wasn't involved in the podcast and apparently rejected a kind of approach at all, didn't even acknowledge the requests of Tortoise for the podcast. But at one point she told Scarlett that she was the 14th girl who had come to her with a similar story. So it's just a really murky, weird, it's a grey area. And that's the bulk of the podcast, is they're discussing that just how ill-defined the whole situation is.
And we should be clear that Gaiman himself denies these allegations and has been very vocal about that. As well, we're in this moment where he's got a show on Netflix, he's got a show on Amazon, he's got Good Omens season coming along. But all these are going ahead, and so far, in terms of his creative output, there's been no cancellation or pausing, right?
Yeah, nothing close to a cancellation. I just saw on Deadline a minute ago that there was an article about Sandman season 2 who's in it, and they're treating it just like it's like nothing's happened, which is kind of unusual because even, I don't know if it points to kind of society being less jumpy about sort of allegations like this, but usually within days of any sort of allegations like this being made, representatives are dropping the people who have been accused, projects are being dropped. And this doesn't seem to be happening. So part of me wonders if, because the investigation came in the form of a podcast that's kind of hidden behind an almost paywall. They ask you to download an app to listen to it. So it hasn't had that kind of widespread breakthrough, or I don't know what it is, but everything seems to be moving ahead as normal for him.
And even the woman who is 22, the former nanny, those accusations took place in New Zealand, correct?
That's right, yeah.
Gaiman even offered himself up for questioning, to take questions from police officers down there, and they declined so far to interview him. So it's not as though he has not offered even also to cooperate, we should point out.
Yeah, and another thing, it just adds to the sort of the murk of the story. It's not as cut and dried as some of like a Harvey Weinstein situation or anything like that. His denials have been so strong. Anything that happened was consensual. So yeah, I don't know how on earth anyone's going to get to the bottom of actually what happened.
Well, Stu, we're going to be relying on you to follow this story as it continues to unfold. It sounds like this might just be the beginning, perhaps.
I think so. Yeah, there are some big parts of the story that haven't spoken. And I feel like with this sort of thing, if there's any kind of continued public interest, it'll only be a matter of time before more details come out one way or the other.
And Stu, because we have you on the phone, big week last week in the UK with Sir Keir Starmer entering the hallowed halls of 10 Downing. How are you feeling?
It's interesting. I quite like it. It's nice with the French election results as well. It feels like everything is taking a turn for the better. I speak to my own personal politics, I know. But yeah, I feel like America's got a bit of catching up to do now.
Oh, we've got our own dramas going on, Stu.
Stu, we know you're rooting for us, buddy. Thank you.
Of course, always.
Stu, wishing you and the family a wonderful summer. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Stu.
Cheers.
This is a really fun story that we have out of Denmark, of all places. Mary Holland, who's one of our wonderful travel writers, is on intimate terms with this country and its many fascinating cities. She travels there often, and she's here to tell us about how one fascinating resort town with a very small population could perhaps, maybe, we don't know, become the next East Hampton, thanks to, of all things, the incredible success of Novo Nordisk, the parent company of Wegovy, Ozempic, and half the world's insulin production. Welcome, Mary.
Oh, thank you so much. It's really lovely to be here.
So, Mary, you are a journalist who covers many things, but especially travel. Tell us about how long have you been going to Denmark?
Gosh, I think I've been going for probably around 8 years. I can't remember the exact year that I went, but I go sort of do an annual trip to Copenhagen, and then I sort of bounce off somewhere else to the north of the country or to one of the islands. So yeah, it's been a pretty long sort of travel affair.
And tell us all about the Danish Riviera. I mean, when you sent along this idea, like the words just jumped out at me because we hear about the French Riviera, the Spanish Riviera to a certain extent. Now, thanks to Meghan Markle, the West Coast Riviera or American Riviera Orchard, but the Danish Riviera has been mysterious. So what is it?
So basically, it's an area it's about an hour north of Copenhagen, and it's an area called North Zealand. And it's an area that a lot of Copenhageners have been going for decades, really. It's a beautiful coastline. There's some really lovely beaches, sandy pebbled beaches. And in the summertime, it just kind of springs to life. Obviously, the Danish summers are quite short. And a lot of Danes are known to have these sort of summer cabins, and they have them around the country. And they go and they spend a lot of time there. During the summertime, they go, as with many European countries, they sort of log off in July through August, and they just go and spend time there by the beach, by the seaside. And yeah, so it's just been this place, the sort of stomping ground for a long time. And it's a lot of Copenhagen's creative class. Because it's close, it sort of attracts a lot more people sort of than the north of the country. And because of that, there's been this sort of birth of towns that have been there for a long time, but they've kind of received some lovely hotels and restaurants. And while they have received an influx of certain elements, they've also remained quite low key, which I think is really lovely because compared to the French Riviera or the Hamptons, which I've spent time in both, it's just a little bit more modest, a little bit more low key, a little bit more laid back, which I think is very true to sort of Danish culture.
Is it fair to say, Mary, that the vibe, if not the exact sort of specifics of these towns, could remind us of the Hamptons like in the 1970s before the billionaire class arrived and all the luxury boutiques arrived? Like, has it still retained that charm and sort of family-friendly sensibility?
Absolutely. I mean, obviously, I haven't been to the Hamptons when it was in the 70s, so I didn't see that, but I've been to the Hamptons today. And I imagine it would be how it was 30 years ago. It's the kind of place that you can go and you feel like if you bring like sand into your bedroom, it's not an issue. And you don't have to be wearing flashy clothing. There's no super expensive cars. I mean, I think in Denmark, something that would be seen as flashy is a black Audi. You're not going to see any like yellow Hummers or anything like that. So I think it's retained the sense of kind of as a really lovely holiday vibe. And there aren't a lot of flashy shops and restaurants. If there are, there's one sort of little shop in Tisvilde and they sell like some organic cotton things that are super cool, but you're not going to find big brands there. And you're not going to find a lot of celebrities that go there either. I mean, Jeremy Strong is known to have a house there, but it's still pretty low key. And I think it will hopefully stay that way, although we're not so sure.
So which brings us to another part of our story. We've been talking about Novo Nordisk, which is a pharmaceutical company based in a nearby town to the Danish Riviera. And I mean, this has been one of the biggest success stories of the global economy in the past few years. They've increased the GDP of the entire country by 1.8% due to the success of Wegovy, Ozempic, and other drugs that they produce. I mean, Mary, how do you see this impacting the Danish Riviera?
I mean, my understanding is that it will impact it significantly. And I know in the town of Kalundborg, there's obviously been a lot of change already. There's been huge job creation, a massive ripple effect from the company being based there. It's changed Denmark itself in the way that people are investing in it. There's so much change in terms of people are getting stocks and they're becoming richer, and it affects their BNP and interest rates and everything like that. But when I look at it right now, and other than the exact town of Kalundborg, it hasn't changed significantly yet. I think it's kind of this underlying thing that everybody knows and everybody talks about, but we're not really seeing that impact in that part of the coastline yet. I think perhaps in years to come, maybe people will make a lot more money from their stocks or from the jobs that they have and be able to buy more homes, but it still has this very kind of low-key vibe, which I was explaining earlier. There's not something that you can visibly see when you go there. But I definitely know that it's obviously something that a lot of Danes are talking about. It's just a little bit sort of quieter. We're not seeing them talk about it on a sort of a major level when you're in that area.
Mary, I don't want to sound like a New Yorker who, listening to you, like, oh, okay, so the housing prices haven't gone up yet, so maybe I can be predatory and get in there before they are. Should I get out there like Jeremy Strong and try and buy a house as a market before it really explodes?
I mean, perhaps. I don't think it's that easy to come by houses in the area. I think a lot of these houses have been owned by families for generations, and they will continue to be owned by families. They're sort of passed on from one family to the next, but it's not cheap. In Tisvilde, it's not cheap to buy a beachside house. And I don't have the numbers on me right now, how much it would cost, but if you're going to get a beachside cabin, it's going to be pretty pricey because obviously the people that are going there already are incredibly wealthy and they've been going there for a very, very long time. So I'm not sure. You could maybe find somewhere. I mean, I think it's a little bit far if you're not based in Copenhagen. It's quite a bit of a hike to get there. And of course, you can only go a certain couple of months a year because the winters, as you know, in Denmark are really long. They're pretty dark. And it's not really the ideal place to be. But I think that maybe you could find something that would be a decent price now. And I'm sure that it will change in the coming years. And I think maybe beyond the town of Tisvilde, which is already sort of this very she town, there's lots of other little towns along that coastline that are a lot more low key. There's like the Gilleleje fishing village. And so maybe you could pick up something there that could be a little bit more affordable. Or if you want to be in Tisvilde, maybe you just won't be on the beach.
Maybe one thing that's good when I just want to you're making me remind myself that there's Danish and there's Danish design, and those people are not crass by nature. They're pretty low key, and I can imagine they're going to protect this area and not be like building McMansions as have done on New York's East End and bulldozing away things. So it's probably good they're going to limit the number of houses, and as you say, it's an intergenerational thing where they've got to be handed down. So all the better.
Yeah, I certainly think so. I think, as you mentioned, like the Danes, when it comes to design, everything, they're pretty modest culture, and I don't know how welcomed you would be if you sort of moved in and built a giant flashy house. And I think nor would you want to, because it's always more about sort of quality than quantity. And that's just very sort of true to Danish culture in every single way. So I agree with you, Michael. I think that they will definitely protect it, especially these sort of towns that have been drawing very wealthy Copenhagers for decades.
Mary, I have an important question.
Yes.
So during winter, I'm always seeing on Instagram that Scandinavian word. What is that word?
It's hygge. I'm probably also not saying it correctly, but it's hygge.
Okay, there's that Scandinavian word hygge, which is like comfort and cozy during the winter. Is there a Scandinavian approximation for like what they feel during the summer and those midnight summers and all that kind of thing?
I think hygge isn't really just seasonal. I think it's something that kind of extends throughout the year. It's very much obviously about the warmth and feeling sort of like comforted during those long winters. People light a lot of candles. Even at lunchtime, they have beautiful candles. They bake beautiful breads. There's this real sense of comfort. But I think that extends through to the summertime as well, because it's also about, hygge is also about sort of taking time out. For me, a really lovely example is just sitting on a couch and sharing a piece of cake and a cup of tea with a friend and sort of making time for that. And I think that can be done in the summertime as well, where people really go to these towns and they stay at these, either they stay in their homes or they stay at these seaside hotels. They're called bath hotels. And they're very simple, very chic, but very, very simple. And just go there for about 6 weeks. And I think that can also translate to hygge because they really know how to take time off and they understand a good quality of life. And I think that's very important to what the meaning of hygge is. So I think it sort of extends year round. But yes, they are definitely enjoying those summers. It's a beautiful time to be in Denmark because you really see the country come alive, especially even in Copenhagen. People are jumping in the harbor every day. They're swimming, until midnight in the water. So it's a beautiful time to see these people just spring to life and really embrace summer. I think in New York, we obviously embrace summer as well because we have these long winters. But I think they really embrace it in a very different way where they're constantly outside and just absorbing the sun, which sets 10, 11 p.m. every night.
Well, Mary, thank you so much for this great story. It's so fascinating. And once again, Michael and I have FOMO, and I can't believe I didn't go visit this incredible region when I was in Copenhagen back in April, but that just means I have to go back. So thank you so much for illuminating all of us, and we wish you a marvelous summer.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you having me, and I hope that you'll make it there next year. Southern Europe is only getting hotter, and so more and more people are traveling to Scandinavia and enjoying those sort of cool evenings and warm days.
All right, Mary, get back on the road. We need some more intel from you. Have a great one.
Thanks so much, you too. Bye-bye.
There's only one place to discover a global snapshot of the current cultural scene. AML's Arts Intel Report. Our international research tool for what to do and where and when to do it is user-friendly, continuously updated, and meticulously curated. Arts Intel is handy at home, on the road, and when you're planning your next trip. It also includes indispensable lists of restaurants and hotels in key cities around the world, recommended by our well-traveled experts. Explore Arts Intel at airmail.news/arts-intel, and be sure to sign up for our Week in Culture newsletter, which is published every Wednesday afternoon at airmail.news/WIC. I'm Chris Garrett, an Airmail Deputy Editor, and I never leave home without it. Bon voyage.
Michael, we got to go now before it's ruined.
I know, before it becomes 50 kroner or whatever it is for a pint of Danish strawberries from the wild strawberries, and who knows, but I would like to go there. It's supposed to be gorgeous.
It sounds like it. Once again, Mary's giving me FOMO. Well, Michael, it is the weekend. I know you've got something you can recommend to help us pass the time.
I do. We recently had our summer break, Ashley, as you know, here at Airmail, and I decided to do something very summery. See a big, fat, action-packed Hollywood summer movie. In this case, it was The Fall Guy. You probably remember it. It came out a couple of weeks ago. It stars Ryan Gosling as a stuntman who happens to be in love with Emily Blunt, a successful movie director. So it's a mashup, actually, of action movie and rom-com, a movie that seems built in a lab designed to appeal to guys and their wives. And I have to confess, it worked for me. The stunts are fun, but more than that, the chemistry between Blunt and Gosling is pretty great. And especially, I would say, Blunt's deft touch at playing humor, which is pretty damn sexy and a lot of fun to watch. Is this movie going to change your life? No, but if it's a hot summer night and you're looking to get out of the house and maybe remember what summer movies were for, this is for you. Or you can also stay in and watch it, as it is also streaming on Apple as well. It is called The Fall Guy, and it is playing now. And you, my dear, what can you recommend?
Okay, Michael, I'm reading this fabulous novel by the incredible novelist Joseph O'Neill. Have you read any of his work?
I have. I read Netherlands when that came out. Was a big fan of that, 15, 20 years ago?
Well, this is really wonderful. It's a really well done and totally strange new novel about two brothers who are traipsing all over the place, trying to track down this African soccer star who may just be the key to happiness and wealth for both of them. It's a really interesting story about familial relationships, the changing ways of the workplace, the way that we interact with our siblings, and the way that we reckon with our pasts. And it's really beautifully written. O'Neill's a wonderful writer of prose, but also this is one of those plots that feels so much stranger than fiction and yet is completely believable and a really pleasant and strange place to live when you're reading it. So I highly recommend it. It's called Godwin by Joseph O'Neill.
Put it on the list now. Summer reading.
Oh, Michael, I have one more thing too. We were on holiday and we haven't even talked about this, but I saw Taylor Swift at Wembley in London.
My favorite thing that I know about you seeing Taylor Swift in Wembley in London is on your Instagram. There you were at the last highest final row of seats in Wembley. It was so cute.
It's so true. We were actually in the top row of Wembley. It was hilarious. And I was with my friend and her daughter who was so excited and was really hoping to have quote unquote VIP seats. And I was like, honey, we are in the top row of Wembley. We're just happy to be here. I mean, they were still an absolute fortune. And I did find myself sort of wishing that I had invested in slightly better seats just because you could really only see Taylor on the screen. You couldn't see all of her dancers very well. It was really an incredible performance. Like, even if you don't like her music, which between us, I was not the biggest fan of it before I went to this concert, but there's something so gratifying about seeing expertise, whether it's in sports or politics or literature or whatever. And she has that for pop music and she knows how to put on a show, man. And it was just incredibly fun and well done, beautifully executed. There's something about the energy too of that room. Wembley, it was like 89,000 people were there that night. And you could feel every one of them having this kind of joy. And the cumulative effect of all of that happiness was really something to behold. So I left a Taylor Swift fan. I've been listening to the Eras Tour playlist ever since. And Michael, I can't even believe it. I am tempted to go back and see her when she is playing in Warsaw in a couple of weeks. I probably won't do it because the tickets are so expensive, but...
We've created a Swiftie. Ladies and gentlemen, you heard it here first.
I'm a senior Swiftie. I'm not ashamed to admit it. In the world that we live in, a little bit of happiness.
I want to see you at Glastonbury next year. That's where I want to see you.
I'm tempted, Michael. I'm not a huge festival person.
I know, you're not that girl. You're not that girl. You don't like mud and wellies. I get it.
I went to Coachella the first few years that Coachella was a thing, and that was great, but that was also a very long time ago. So I don't know. I'm going to end up at Glastonbury at some point. Just the writing is on the wall, but I'm now a Wembley fan. I'm even considering going and seeing Coldplay in Ireland later this summer. Anyway, okay, stop me before I become a complete music junkie. But if you have the chance to see Taylor and you're on the fence about it, you won't regret it. It's just a cool cultural moment. And with that, we wish you all a wonderful weekend. Michael, can't wait to see you soon, hopefully. Thank you all so much for joining us. Will you please read us out?
Morning Meeting is produced by Airplay Productions and edited by Jesse Cannon. Our co-editors are Graydon Carter and Alexander Stanley. Our chief operating officer is Bill Keenan, and our deputy editors are Ashley Baker, Chris Garrett, Nathan King, Julie Vitale, and Ash Carter. Our CMO is Emily Davis, and our music supervisor is Randall Poster. Our theme music is The Cute Monster by the Buddy Collette Quintet. A new edition of Airmail is published every Saturday, so please subscribe and enjoy all of our stories on airmail.news, which we update every day. You can also find us on Twitter and Instagram at Airmail Weekly, but we will be back here next Saturday with another edition of Morning Meeting. But in the meantime, be sure to subscribe at Spotify or Apple Music. But most of all, thank you again for joining us.